frontier, pouring pale gold over dry grass and long fences, turning the open land into something that looked calm even when it was not. Wind moved slow across the plains, brushing against the tall weeds and carrying dust along the rutted trail that led away from town. Nothing here stayed hidden for long, not footsteps, not secrets, not hearts that beat too loud in a place where silence ruled most days. The rancher rode alone, his horse steady beneath him, boots worn thin from years of work and walking land that never truly belonged to anyone. His hat cast a shadow over eyes that had seen hard winters and lonely nights, eyes that watched the horizon more often than they watched people. He was known in the frontier as a man who kept to himself, not unkind but distant, the sort of man folks nodded at rather than spoke to for long. Beyond the last fence line, near a bend in the creek where cottonwoods leaned low, she waited. Her dress was simple and faded, patched at the hem, dust clinging to the fabric as if the land itself refused to let her go. She stood with her hands folded tight, shoulders tense, eyes searching the open space behind her more than the trail ahead. In this land, being seen could be as dangerous as being alone. She had not planned to meet him there, not truly. Circumstances had pushed her toward that quiet stretch of land, away from the town and its sharp eyes. The frontier had rules written without ink, and one of them was that a woman alone drew stories like flies. She knew those stories well, had heard them whispered about others, had seen lives bent and broken by nothing more than rumor. When the rancher dismounted, the sound of his boots hitting the ground made her flinch. He raised his hand slightly, slow and careful, as if calming a frightened horse. He spoke her name softly, not to claim it, only to remind her she was not alone in that moment. His voice carried no judgment, only concern and something quieter that surprised even him. They spoke of small things at first, of weather and water levels and the way the town had been restless lately. Each word felt measured, chosen carefully, as if either of them feared that saying the wrong thing might break something fragile between them. The space around them felt exposed, despite the empty land stretching for miles. As the conversation deepened, her guard slipped without her noticing. She spoke of the weight she carried, the eyes that followed her, the feeling of being trapped by expectations she never chose. The rancher listened, truly listened, his jaw tightening as he realized how alone she had been even while surrounded by people. He stepped closer, not with force but with intention, drawn by the need to offer comfort in a world that offered little. His presence was steady, grounding, like the land beneath their feet. For a brief moment, the frontier seemed to hold its breath. That was when she saw movement on the distant ridge. Her breath caught sharp in her chest as fear rushed through her, cold and sudden. She reached out and grabbed his sleeve, fingers trembling as her eyes locked onto the horizon. Her voice dropped to a whisper, urgent and desperate, begging him to stop before anyone could see what should not be seen. In that instant, the rancher understood the true danger. It was not the land, nor the wild, nor even the hard life they lived. It was the town behind them, the unspoken rules, the way judgment traveled faster than truth. He could step back, let distance return, allow her fear to dictate the moment, and walk away unchanged. The wind shifted, carrying the sound of hooves far off, faint but unmistakable. Someone was out there, maybe watching, maybe not, but the possibility alone was enough to tighten the air between them. The woman's grip grew stronger, her eyes pleading for him to disappear from this place, with her dignity still intact. The rancher looked at her, really looked, and something inside him hardened not with anger, but with resolve. He had spent his life yielding to the frontier, bending to storms and drought and silence. He had followed rules that never protected anyone who truly needed it. In her fear, he saw the cost of always hiding. He did not pull away. Instead, he stayed where he was, grounding his boots into the dust as if daring the land to move him. His choice was quiet but powerful, a refusal to let fear decide what was right. The woman felt it instantly, the shift in him, and it terrified her as much as it steadied her. The ridge stood empty again, the movement gone, but the moment could not be undone. The frontier had a way of sensing when something important had happened, even before word reached town. The wind carried more than dust now, it carried the promise of consequence. She swallowed hard, knowing that whatever followed would change her life. The rancher tipped his hat slightly, not in greeting but in acceptance of what he had chosen. The open plains stretched around them, wide and unforgiving, ready to witness whatever came next. And somewhere beyond the horizon, the town waited, unaware that a single decision made in the quiet of the frontier was about to shake it to its core. The moment stretched longer than either of them expected, heavy as the heat resting on the plains. The woman loosened her grip only slightly. Her fingers still curled into the rancher's sleeve as if letting go might pull the ground from beneath her feet. Her eyes moved again toward the ridge, then back toward the distant line where the town lay hidden beyond low hills and dust. The rancher followed her gaze and felt the weight of that unseen place press against his chest. He knew those streets, knew how words traveled from porch to porch, how stories grew teeth by nightfall. He had watched men ruined by talk and women broken by silence. Still, he did not move away from her, not now. A faint sound reached them, the creak of leather and the slow rhythm of hooves traveling across hard earth. It was not close enough to see, but close enough to feel. The woman shook her head once, fear tightening her throat, and begged him again in a low voice to step back, to leave her standing alone as she always had. He answered without raising his voice, telling her she was not alone in this place, not anymore. The words surprised her and seemed to surprise him as well. They carried more weight than he had intended, settling between them like a promise spoken too soon. From the rise beyond the creek, two riders emerged, their shapes dark against the pale sky. They did not rush, did not hide, but rode with the calm confidence of men who believed the land belonged to them. The woman stiffened, her body turning slightly as if preparing to run. Though there was nowhere to go without drawing more attention, the rancher shifted his stance, placing himself half a step in front of her, not shielding her entirely but making his presence clear. The riders slowed as they approached, their eyes sharp with curiosity and something close to satisfaction. In a town starved for excitement, even a hint of scandal was enough to stir hunger. The first rider tipped his hat with a smile that never reached his eyes. He spoke casually, asking what business brought them so far from town. His tone was light, but his gaze lingered too long on the woman, measuring her fear as if it were proof of guilt. Before she could answer, the rancher spoke, steady and calm, saying they stood on his land and meant no harm. His voice carried authority earned through years of quiet work rather than loud claims. The second rider frowned slightly, clearly disappointed that the moment did not unfold with more drama. They exchanged glances, sensing something beneath the surface they could not quite name. The woman felt her heart pound as if it might betray her with its sound. She waited for the rancher to step aside, to let the riders focus on her, to allow the usual rules to take their course. He did not. Instead, he remained where he was, eyes level, posture unyielding. He made no effort to explain her presence, no attempt to distance himself from her. In that simple act, he challenged something older than either of them, a frontier code that demanded women carry shame alone. The riders lingered, testing the air, then one laughed softly and said the town had been restless, full of talk about people forgetting their place. The words were meant as a warning, sharp enough to cut without sounding like a threat. The woman felt her breath catch again, waiting for the rancher to respond with caution. His reply was measured but firm, saying the frontier had room for people to stand where they chose. Silence followed, thick and uncomfortable. Even the wind seemed to pause, as if waiting to see which way the balance would tip. At last the riders moved on, their interest dulled by resistance. They turned their horses back toward town, already carrying fragments of the scene with them, pieces that would soon be shaped into something larger than truth. The woman watched until they disappeared, her knees trembling now that the danger had passed. She pulled her hand away at last, guilt flooding her face. She told him he should not have done that being seen with her would only bring trouble. Her voice broke as she spoke, years of fear rising all at once. The rancher listened, then surprised her again by smiling faintly, not with ease but with resolve. He said trouble found people whether they invited it or not, and he was tired of letting it decide who deserved kindness. His words were plain, without romance, yet they struck deeper than any promise she had ever heard. They began to walk slowly toward the horses, the open land no longer feeling quite as empty as before. The woman kept her eyes low, struggling to understand what his choice meant for her future. She had lived her life shrinking from notice, believing survival meant staying unseen. As they reached the creek, she stopped and looked at him, finally meeting his eyes without fear. She asked him why he was willing to risk so much for someone the town already whispered about. The question hung between them, raw and unguarded. He took his time answering, then said he had watched the frontier break good people simply because no one stood beside them when it mattered. He had sworn long ago that, if the moment ever came, he would not look away again. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows that stretched toward the town. Somewhere beyond those hills, words were already taking shape, ready to travel faster than either of them could ride. The woman knew her life would never return to what it had been. As they mounted their horses, the rancher glanced once more toward the distant rooftops and felt the weight of what lay ahead. The frontier did not forgive easily, and the town would demand answers he was not sure he owed. They rode side by side toward the fading light, not touching, not speaking, yet bound by a decision that could no longer be undone. A choice made in the open plains that would soon test them both in ways neither could yet imagine. The town revealed itself slowly as they rode closer, rooftops rising from the dust like watchful eyes that never truly closed. Wooden buildings leaned into one another as if sharing secrets. Their porches already occupied by men who paused mid-conversation when they saw the pair approach together. The woman felt every gaze before it reached her face, felt the weight of judgment settle heavy on her shoulders. The rancher rode at an even pace, neither rushing nor slowing, as though this arrival had always been meant to happen this way. His posture was straight, his expression calm, yet inside him something burned steady and unyielding. He had crossed this street 100 times before, but never with the same awareness of how narrow it truly was. Whispers moved faster than the horses. A woman at the dry goods store leaned toward another, eyes sharp with curiosity. A pair of men near the saloon straightened, one nudging the other as recognition sparked. The frontier loved a story, and this one was already taking shape before anyone spoke aloud. The woman kept her hands tight around the reins, her breath shallow. She wanted to disappear into the saddle, to become invisible as she had learned to do since girlhood. Yet the rancher rode beside her, close enough that she could feel the quiet certainty of his presence, and that steadiness kept her from turning back. They dismounted near the hitching post, the sound of hooves fading behind them as riders passed without slowing. The rancher tied his horse with care, deliberate in every movement. The woman hesitated, then followed his lead, her fingers trembling as she looped the rope and stepped back. Silence pressed in, thick and expectant. The town waited, breath held, as if the air itself sensed that something was about to shift. The woman could feel her heart pounding against her ribs, each beat a reminder that she was no longer hidden. A man stepped forward from the saloon porch, broad-shouldered and confident, known for speaking before thinking. He smiled in a way that carried more challenge than warmth and asked loudly if there was something the town ought to know. Laughter rippled from a few others, thin and uneasy. Before she could retreat behind the rancher, he moved half a step forward, placing himself clearly between her and the crowd. His voice carried across the street, calm but firm, saying there was nothing secret about two people standing where they chose. The words were simple, yet they landed hard. Murmurs followed, some skeptical, some surprised. The woman stared at the ground, heat rising in her face, waiting for the sharp edge of accusation she had grown used to. Instead, she heard a woman nearby scoff softly, while another shifted uncomfortably, unsure which side to stand on. An older man leaned against a post, eyes narrowed with thought rather than anger. He had lived long enough to see the frontier change and knew courage when it appeared. He said nothing, but his silence carried weight. The rancher turned slightly toward the woman, his voice lowering so only she could hear. He told her to stand straight, not as an order but as an invitation. Something inside her resisted at first, then slowly gave way. She lifted her chin, her back straightening despite the fear still clawing at her chest. For the first time, the town truly looked at her, not as a rumor or a cautionary tale, but as a person standing in the open. The realization unsettled more than a few of them. It was easier to judge a shadow than a face. A shout broke the moment as one of the earlier riders returned, his horse stopping hard near the group. He spoke quickly, spreading a version of events shaped by distance and assumption. His words painted the woman as reckless and the rancher as foolish. The rancher listened without interruption, then answered evenly, correcting nothing and denying nothing. He said only that he would not be told where to stand or who to stand beside. His refusal to argue seemed to unsettle the rider more than anger would have. The woman felt something unfamiliar rise within her, a strength she had never allowed herself to claim. She took a step forward, her voice shaking at first but growing steadier as she spoke. She said she was tired of being spoken about as if she were not present, tired of being treated like a warning instead of a person. The street fell quiet again, deeper this time. No one laughed, no one interrupted. Her words were not dramatic, not rehearsed, but they carried the weight of truth long buried. Even those who disagreed felt it. A woman from the crowd nodded slowly, recognition flickering in her eyes. Another looked away, shame coloring her face. The frontier had always demanded endurance, but it had never prepared anyone for honesty spoken aloud. The rancher watched her with something close to pride, though he said nothing. He had expected resistance from the town, but he had not expected this moment of her finding her own ground. It strengthened his resolve more than any approval could have. As the sun dipped lower, casting amber light across the street, the crowd began to thin. Some returned to their business, unsettled but thoughtful. Others lingered, unsure what to make of what they had witnessed. The rancher reached for his hat and settled it back into place, a quiet signal that the moment had passed, but the choice remained. He turned to the woman and asked if she wished to leave or stay. For the first time, the decision felt like hers. She looked around the street, at the buildings that had once felt like walls closing in. Then she looked at him and answered that she was done running. Her voice was calm now, certain in a way that surprised even her. Together they walked forward, not toward escape, but deeper into the town, aware that every step would echo beyond this day. The frontier had been challenged not by force, but by two people refusing to hide, and the land itself seemed to recognize the shift as dusk settled over the wild old west. Morning came slow over the frontier, the kind of dawn that carried both promise and warning in its pale light. The town woke uneasy, as if it remembered something uncomfortable from the night before, but had not yet decided how to name it. Doors opened with caution, boots stepped onto porches heavier than usual, and eyes turned toward the street where everything had shifted. The woman woke in a small rented room above the dry goods store, her sleep broken and shallow. She lay still for a long while, listening to the sounds below, carts rolling, voices murmuring, life continuing as if nothing had changed. Yet everything felt different inside her, like the ground beneath her feet had moved just enough to make standing still impossible. She dressed slowly, hands steady despite the knot in her chest. The mirror showed the same face she had always known, yet something in her eyes looked stronger, more awake. She remembered standing in the street the evening before, remembered her own voice carrying farther than she had ever allowed it to. The memory both frightened and steadied her. Outside, the rancher had already risen. He stood near the hitching post, tightening a strap on his saddle, the morning light cutting sharp lines across his face. He had slept little, his thoughts circling the same truth again and again. The frontier did not forget challenges easily, and the town would answer yesterday in its own way. Men gathered in small knots near the saloon, their voices low but intense. Some argued that the rancher had crossed a line that kept order in a hard place. Others said quietly that maybe the line had been wrong all along. The division was clear even before words grew loud. A woman carrying a basket paused when she saw the rancher, her expression unreadable. After a moment she nodded once, almost imperceptibly, and continued on. It was a small thing, but he noticed. In this land, small things often meant more than grand gestures. The woman stepped out onto the porch above, the wood creaking beneath her boots. Several heads turned at once. She felt the familiar pull to retreat, to disappear back into the room, but she resisted it. She rested her hands on the railing and looked out over the street, claiming her place in the open daylight. The rancher looked up and met her gaze. He tipped his hat slightly, not as a signal to anyone else, but to her alone. That simple acknowledgement grounded her more than any words could have. Before the morning could settle, a rider came in fast from the edge of town, dust trailing behind his horse. He dismounted roughly and pushed through the small crowd that had begun to form. His voice rose sharp and accusing, demanding answers, demanding order be restored. He spoke of tradition, of how things had always been done, of the danger of letting emotion weaken the frontier. His words found willing ears among those who feared change more than injustice. The street tightened again, tension pulling like a rope drawn too far. The rancher stepped forward, not to argue, but to stand where he had already chosen to stand. He said the frontier survived because people adapted, not because they clung to fear. His voice was calm, but it carried across the street, steady as the land itself. The rider scoffed and turned his anger toward the woman, accusing her of bringing trouble where it did not belong. The words cut deep, old wounds reopening with sudden force. For a moment her breath faltered, then she spoke again. Her voice was stronger than before, shaped by a night of reckoning rather than desperation. She said she had lived quietly, obeyed every rule laid before her, and still found herself judged and constrained. She said if decency meant silence in the face of cruelty, then the frontier needed to rethink its pride. The crowd shifted uneasily. Some looked away, others stared openly, struck by the power of her calm honesty. She did not beg, did not accuse, did not apologize. She simply told the truth as she had lived it. An older woman stepped forward from the edge of the group, her face lined by years of endurance. She said softly that she remembered a time when she too had been warned to stay quiet, to accept her place. Her words opened something long sealed in the air. One by one, people began to speak, not all in agreement, but all unable to pretend nothing had happened. The frontier thrived on silence, and that silence was breaking. The rider who had stirred the moment realized control was slipping. He mounted his horse again, leaving with sharp words about consequences and reckoning. His departure felt less like a victory and more like a promise of trouble yet to come. As the sun climbed higher, the crowd thinned. The town did not resolve itself in a single morning, but it could not return to what it had been either. Something had shifted beneath the dust and timber. The rancher walked with the woman toward the edge of the street, not away from town, but toward its heart. He asked her quietly if she regretted speaking. She shook her head, surprising herself with the certainty of it. She told him fear had ruled her for too long, and whatever came next would come whether she hid or not. Saying the words felt like stepping into sunlight after years of shadow. They paused near the well, the place where news always gathered first. Children played nearby, unaware of the weight hanging over the adults. The woman watched them and felt a strange hope rise within her, fragile but real. The rancher knew the frontier would test them yet. There would be resistance, whispers, perhaps worse. But he also knew that something true had taken root, and the land had a way of honoring truth in time. As the afternoon wore on, the town continued its routines with a new undercurrent, quieter but undeniable. People glanced at the pair not with the same certainty as before, but with questions forming where judgment once stood. The woman stood taller as the day passed, her steps firmer, her gaze clearer. She was no longer simply enduring the frontier. She was shaping her place within it, and as the wild old West carried on beneath the wide sky, the choice made in the open plains continued to ripple outward, challenging a town that had long believed itself unchanging. The frontier did not sleep easily after that morning, even as the sun climbed and fell again behind the low hills. Night brought no peace, only long shadows and restless thoughts carried through thin walls and open windows. Lamps burned late in the saloon and early in the homes where worry had taken root. The woman sat alone in her room as dusk settled, hands folded in her lap, listening to the town breathe around her. Every sound felt louder now, footsteps in the street, a door closing, a distant laugh. She knew the rider who left in anger would not forget, and neither would those who agreed with him in silence. The rancher stood outside near the corral, leaning against a post, eyes fixed on the darkening horizon. He had faced storms and stampedes, but this felt different. This was a slow danger, one that crept through words and looks rather than wind and hooves. He understood the frontier well enough to know that change always invited resistance. A pair of men passed nearby, their voices low, glancing toward him before turning away. He caught fragments of their talk, enough to know the town was dividing itself along old lines. Some admired what he had done, even if they would never say it aloud. Others sharpened their resentment, waiting for the right moment. Later that evening, a knock came at the woman's door. Her body stiffened, fear rising before thought could catch it. She rose slowly and opened the door to find an older woman standing there. Her face worn but kind, hands clasped tight around a shawl. The older woman spoke softly. saying she had watched everything unfold and wished she had found her courage years earlier. She said the town had a way of burying voices like theirs, and she did not want to see that happen again. The words settled gently, offering comfort without demanding anything in return. When the door closed again, the woman felt less alone than she had in a very long time. She sat by the window and looked out at the stars, realizing that even small acts of support could change the shape of a hard place. The next morning arrived heavy with tension. News traveled faster than the sun, and by the time the street filled, everyone knew that a meeting was being called near the courthouse. The writer who had left in anger had gathered others, determined to restore what he called order. The rancher met the woman outside before the gathering, his expression steady but serious. He told her there might be harsh words ahead, perhaps worse, and that she did not have to stand there if she chose not to. His voice carried no pressure, only honesty. She listened, then shook her head slowly. She said she had hidden long enough, and whatever came next should meet her standing upright rather than bowed. Saying it aloud filled her with both fear and strength, intertwined so tightly she could no longer separate them. They walked together toward the square, not touching, but close enough to feel each other's resolve. People watched from doorways and porches, the tension thick enough to taste. The frontier rarely gathered for words alone, and that alone made the moment dangerous. The writer stood at the center, his posture rigid, his voice sharp as he spoke of tradition and warning. He accused the rancher of inviting chaos and the woman of disrupting a balance that had kept the town alive. His words drew murmurs of agreement from some, hard stares from others. The rancher waited until the noise settled, then spoke without raising his voice. He said balance built on fear was no balance at all, only quiet cruelty. He reminded them that the frontier survived because people relied on one another, not because they crushed those who stood out. The woman stepped forward when he finished, her heart racing but her voice clear. She said she had followed every rule she was given and still found herself judged and confined. She asked them what kind of frontier demanded silence from some while others spoke freely. The crowd shifted, unease spreading like a slow wave. Some faces hardened, unwilling to bend. Others softened, recognizing truths they had long ignored. The meeting did not resolve itself in agreement, but the old certainty was gone. Anger flared when one man shouted that the town would not be shamed into change. A step forward became two, tension tightening as hands hovered near belts. The rancher moved subtly, positioning himself where he could see every movement, ready but unwilling to escalate. Before the moment could break, a voice rose from the back, calm and firm. It was the older man who had watched silently the day before. He said the frontier had been built by people willing to endure hardship together, not by those who silenced others to feel strong. His words carried weight earned through years of survival. The crowd quieted again, the sharp edge dulled. The writer at the center realized he no longer commanded the moment and stepped back. His authority weakened even if his anger remained. The meeting ended without resolution, but something vital had shifted. People drifted away in thoughtful silence rather than loud certainty. The frontier rarely changed in a single day, yet it had been forced to look at itself in a way it never had before. As the square emptied, the woman felt the tremor in her legs finally catch up with her. The rancher noticed and walked beside her, offering his presence without words. She told him she did not know what tomorrow would bring. He answered that tomorrow had always been uncertain in this land, and that was no reason to live in fear. His words were simple, but they rang true. They paused near the edge of town, where the buildings gave way to open land. The sky stretched wide above them, endless and indifferent, yet somehow comforting. The woman breathed deep, grounding herself in the vastness she had once feared. The rancher knew trouble was not finished with them. There would be whispers, perhaps retaliation, perhaps loss. But he also knew the frontier respected those who stood firm in the open, even when it resisted them at first. As the sun lowered again, casting long shadows across the dirt road, they stood together without hiding. The wild old West had been challenged not by force or violence, but by courage spoken aloud, and the land itself seemed to listen, waiting to see what kind of future would rise from it. The final morning arrived quiet and clear, the kind of calm that settled only after a storm had passed through unseen. The town woke slower than usual, as if unsure how to greet a day shaped by so many spoken truths. Doors opened with care, voices stayed low, and the frontier held its breath one last time. The woman stepped into the street with the sunrise warming her face. She felt the weight of the days behind her, but also a strange lightness, as if the ground beneath her had finally steadied. People noticed her presence, but no longer with the sharp hunger of judgment. Some nodded, some looked away, and some simply watched with new understanding. The rancher met her near the edge of town where the land opened wide. His horse stood ready, saddle worn smooth by years of honest work. He looked at her not with expectation but with respect, waiting to see what choice she would make now that fear no longer ruled her steps. Word spread that the rider who had stirred so much anger was leaving. He packed before dawn, unwilling to remain in a place that no longer bent to his voice. His departure did not bring celebration, only a quiet acknowledgement that the frontier had chosen a different path. The town gathered without planning near the square as the sun climbed higher. There was no meeting called, no raised voices demanding attention. People came because something needed to be witnessed, even if no one knew exactly what that was. The older man stepped forward first, his presence steady as stone. He spoke of endurance and of how the frontier survived by facing hard truths rather than burying them. His words carried across the open space, settling into those who listened. The older woman who had knocked on the door the night before stood beside him. She spoke of years spent quiet and careful, of the cost of silence paid slowly over a lifetime. Her voice did not waver, and many felt the weight of her honesty settle deep. The woman listened, heart full and steady, realizing she was no longer standing alone. When she spoke, she did not speak of fear or shame. She spoke of belonging, of choosing to stand in the open even when it was difficult. Her words were not a demand, but an invitation. The rancher stood beside her, his presence solid and unwavering. He said little, only that the frontier belonged to those willing to care for it and for each other. His quiet strength needed no embellishment. The crowd did not answer with cheers or anger. Instead, there was a slow shift, a collective exhale. People looked at one another differently now, seeing neighbors where they once saw rumors. The frontier had not been tamed, but it had been changed. As the gathering dissolved, life returned to motion. Shops opened, horses were saddled, children laughed in the dust. Yet beneath the routine, something new had taken root, a respect born from courage rather than control. The woman walked through the town with her head high, not defiant but peaceful. She felt the future stretching before her like the open plains beyond the last fence. Whatever challenges lay ahead would need her standing firm. The rancher rode with her to the edge of town, where paths divided and choices waited. He asked where she wished to go, not assuming she would follow him or remain behind. The question honored her freedom more than any promise could. She looked out across the land, feeling the pull of possibility. She said she wished to stay, to build something honest where she stood, no longer hiding from the eyes of others. Her choice carried confidence shaped by trial. He smiled then, a rare and quiet thing, and said the land would be better for it. He offered his help not as a claim but as companionship, walking beside rather than leading. Days passed and the town settled into its new rhythm. There were still disagreements, still old habits that clung stubbornly. But the sharpest edges had softened, and the frontier learned that strength could look like understanding. The woman found work that suited her hands and spirit. She spoke freely now, her voice clear and unafraid. Others listened, not because they were forced to, but because they had learned the cost of ignoring truth. The rancher returned to his land often, tending it with the same care as always. Yet he rode into town more now, not as a watcher on the edges, but as part of a shared future. The space between him and the town had narrowed, bridged by respect. Season followed season, and the story of the choice made in the open plains became something quieter and truer than rumor. It was told not as scandal, but as a turning point, a moment when the frontier chose honesty over fear. Under wide skies and shifting light, the land continued its work of shaping those who lived upon it. The wild old West remained harsh and beautiful, demanding and fair in its own way. And in that place, a woman who once begged for secrecy now walked freely, a rancher who refused to hide stood firm, and a town learned that the bravest act was not force or silence,